Hello, and welcome to another tutorial in visual programming using the Prograph language and the Marten development environment. In the last tutorial, we covered the nature of external operations, external constant, external match, get and set. As a reminder, we do not implement the external global or external structure operations. And certainly we have the external procedure. Notice you get to this by holding down the Option Shift key and it can be a little tricky to find. In this particular tutorial, I want to illustrate a few more kind of obscure parts of the Marten development environment. One of the things we want to talk about is how to get a tool up here. No tools are installed quite yet. We want to talk about the operations to local and the local to method operations. And to do that, it's best just to start creating some code. The last few tutorials we've done a lot of illustrating. Here we're going to create some actual code that might be of use to us. And what we're going to do is create a little bit of a document editor for your development. This would be documentation for your classes, for your methods, and so forth. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need a documentation manager. And this guy is going to have the documentation for all of our classes. And we're going to make that a list. You can make a list by having the empty parentheses. That's an empty list. We're going to have universals. Again, the empty list. Another way to do it with the value window. And finally, we're going to have persistence. So the objects at the top level of a section are really the objects we're concerned with. I'm going to hit save. We now have a documentation manager. And we need documentation for each of those things. So we're going to create a documentation class, and we're going to add some attributes for it. We're going to have its name. We're going to have the text of the documentation. And down the road, we will be talking about classes, and so we want to have documentation for each of the class methods and for each of the attributes. Alright, well now we've got our classes set up. And we're going to store the documentation forever and ever in a persistent we're going to call the documentation. And so we want to stick a documentation manager in there. It's empty at the moment, but we'll see how to fill it up in just a second. Well, now we've laid the groundwork for our first example. Our first example is that of a tool, and this will be a tool that will present the documentation for all the universal methods in our project. So we're going to call this universals documentation, and now we're going to make this tool. The way we do this is to select the universal here and go down to the install submenu item and select tool. This is now a tool, and what has happened is this method has now been placed in the tools menu. A tool has no inputs, no outputs, and is code that can be run from this menu item. So there are a few ways to get your code to be run by the Marten environment. One, of course, is through the run application or the run method commands. There are two others. One is to create an editor, which we'll discuss in a future tutorial, and this one is to create a tool. So I put a breakpoint on there. Let's select it, see what happens. Why, there's nothing going on at the moment. But let's run it again and start editing the code on the fly as we normally do in Prograph. And let's make this do something. We're going to create a persistent operation. Persistent. And notice I've typed it correctly because it recognized that it's the name of a persistent. First thing we want to do is update our document manager with all the latest things that we've been doing. Now, we haven't written this method yet. We're just going to let the development environment create it for us. Incorrect type, not an instance. Oh, it's the documentation. Well, fortunately, we can back up, go over here, type in the correct documentation, name of the persistent. Got a little confused there. Now, the method doesn't exist. Do I want to create it? Absolutely. So that's the beauty of Prograph. You can be coding away and running away at the same time. What do we want to do in this particular method? Well, what we want to do is always have the latest set of universals presented to us. So we're going to store information in our universals attribute, and if we already have some information, it will be in the form of an instance of a documentation class, and therefore it will have a name attribute, and we're going to make those list terminals and roots. So this will give us a list of all the names of the universals that we currently have. Now what we want to do is compare that with a list of all the universals, period. And we have a primitive for that. It's called the methods primitive, and if you double click it and take a look at the documentation, it says if you give it a name of a class, well then it'll give you all the methods of that class. If the input is none, methods will give you a list of the names of the universals and get and set methods. We don't do that. We don't support get and set methods. It didn't turn out to be a useful concept, so that doesn't happen. If the name is none. Actually, that's wrong too. If we don't have an input at all, it's going to give us a list of all the methods that are universals. So, what we want to do is take this list of all the universals and check to see if the universal in question already has documentation. So we're going to search for its name in the list of already documented universals. If it isn't there, which means we'll get a 0 in terms of a search in the list. Remember, the in searches a list for a specific item. If we don't have it, we want to make documentation. So there we go, and of course we want to give it this name. Alright, and I'm going to swing out to make a show, because what I'm going to do here is one of our first bit of very useful, but things we haven't covered yet, techniques. This is a list of names. In fact, you know what? Let's go and get that list. There it is. Those are all the universals we have in our project. Now, what we want to do is take each element of that list and search it against a list of all the documentation we have. And if we don't have any documentation for that method, well, then we'll create some. We're going to do this for every element in this list of methods. This won't work. We need to do this set of operations for every single element of this list. Well, the easiest way to do that is to grab those operations and select the operations to local refactoring command. This is a very powerful way to refactor code. I don't know of too many other languages that support something like this, where you just grab a bunch of operations and There you go. You've refactored them into their own local. And we'll call this create documentation. And as we described, we want to do this for all the methods, and we want to get a list of new documentation, which we will then add to the old documentation to come up with a complete list, which we are then going to reinstall into our document manager. I did a Command Shift S there to turn it into a set operation. All right, so we're in pretty good shape here. What happens though if we do find it in the list? This will then be an integer greater than 0. This will fail then because it's testing for 0. It'll jump to the next case. Right now we don't have one. That's bad news. If we were to run this, it would honk at us and tell us we don't have a next case. But we'll just skip right ahead. We know it's coming along. And what we're going to do is just create an empty case. What happens when this case is executed is that an object of type none will be placed on this root. Objects of type none are very special because when you're creating a list after running a case, the nones are all stripped out. So this list has all the methods. This list will be a list of documentation for only the methods that didn't already have documentation. And I'm going to do something here a little fancy. I'm going to like this list to be in alphabetical order. So in fact, I'm going to sort it. And the sort primitive will sort a list. The thing we want to do is sort this list of instances of documentation by their name. So we're going to want 1, 2, 3 inputs into the sort primitive. This one says strip out any duplicates. We don't care about that. We'll put false. But we do want to sort on the attribute, which is actually called name. So we'll put in 2 more inputs. We're going to call this false because we don't want to strip out duplicates. And this we're going to call name. Now this had better turn into a get operation. That means we haven't made a typing mistake because it recognizes it as the name of an attribute. I'm using the name a little too much here. We'll turn it back into a constant, which is what we want. And now this sorted list is going to be what we want to stick back in for our list of universals. Well, let's give this a try. We've already got it kind of going here. Well, we didn't have any universals. We didn't have any documentation for any universals, so everything should come through and fail here. 0. Create some documentation. It's got the name of the method there. No text, nothing yet. So we should have 4 instances of documentation here. We're going to join it with the previous list, of which was empty, so it'll still be 4. We're going to come in, sort on the name. I think it was already sorted, so nothing new will happen there. And then we're going to stick it back in universals. All right, well that looked pretty good. The key thing here that I want to show is that I was going to illustrate something, but we'll do it a little later. But I am going to grab this because I know we're going to need it going forward here. Okay, we have created instances of documentation for all the methods that don't have documentation. However, that documentation is actually pretty sparse because no text has been entered. So what we're going to do now is we are going to select a universal, and we're going to check on its documentation. So first we update to make sure we always have the latest list. Then we're going to do a select. What a select does is it takes a list of strings and a prompt, and it lets you select one of those strings. So let's go and get the selected list of strings are all the universals in our project. We've now got them all. The prompt is going to be select a universal to display documentation. That's kind of a long prompt. Let's see how it works out here. Let's go back to our running method here. Let's back up. Okay, should have 4 universals. Got all their names. Got our prompt. So, you know what? I'm going to back up here. Notice when I cancel, I get a null out of there. So before I forget, if we get a null, we're just going to stop whatever we're doing. I don't want a next case. I actually want to terminate. Okay, now I'm going to put in its documentation, just a little, I guess, better grammatically. All right, so let's back up to that. Oh, it's going to update. Now we already have all of the documentation. Let's go in and just check and see that this works. We've got all the methods. So we had 4 instances of documentation. That was all we needed. So this list should be in fact empty, and it is. So everything is working right there. We're going to get them all. We're going to select them. I'm going to do hello world. Okay, now I've got hello world. I am going to want to pick it out of this list. I'm going to find its position in the list. And the selected strings position in the list of strings is the same as the documentation's position in the list of universals. So we'll use a get nth. And now this should be our documentation. So let's check it out, see if this works. We selected hello world. Its position is 2. Let's get the nth one. That's the documentation for hello world. No text as yet, but we're getting there. We're going to want to get that text, and we're going to want to display it to the user. And we're going to put it in an ask primitive. Ask, I need to add that in myself. The documentation for ask says get a prompt and furnish a default value, and we'll ask you for the text. So we're going to put in a prompt. We're going to call it documentation for universal colon. I'm going to leave a space there, so I'm going to back up to the very front of this string and put another quotation mark. And in order to get the name to display kind of correctly, I'm going to go back and actually stick in a join and get the selected name. And that'll be our prompt. Alright, well, so let's back up. Let's back up. We got the nth, the second instance of documentation. It has no text. We're going to create a nice looking prompt. Documentation for universal hello world. You know what? I'm going to even be a little. Nah, I won't even. And now I'm going to ask. Well, there's nothing there, so I'm going to put in this is the documentation for hello world. Not much information there. I'm going to hit OK. As before, if a null is output, that means you've canceled. What we're going to want to do is actually stick. I just did a Command D to duplicate and a Command Shift to S to turn it into a set operation. We're going to want to stick that text back in there. And we certainly want to check this before we stick the text back in, so we'll hold down the Option key with the selected operation. That creates a synchro. So we're going to check it. There's documentation for Hello World. We're going to stick it in there. And now our documentation instance has the name and the documentation we would like. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to do one other thing now. Well, I'm going to quit, exit the running code, and I'm going to say this whole thing is actually another kind of, this is all code we want to get together. Oops, I meant to do this, kind of get this down there. So I'm going to select all of this, and I'm going to turn this into its own local with operations to local. Bam, and we're going to say display universals documentation. I'm going to put a little backslash in front of, or forward slash in it. And now, with this local selected, I can now select local to method. What a great refactoring operation here. It will now say, what would you like to do with this? Make it a new method? You bet. It's going to have this name, and if it starts with a forward slash, well then it's going to say, what is the class you want to stick it in? And remember, what we're dealing with is an instance of Documentation Manager, so we're going to select that, and boom, we now have this method. And I'm going to delete the Documentation Manager because I want it to be a data-driven kind of method. Who knows, maybe I'll have some different kind of Documentation Manager down the road. Move it over, cinch it up. There we go. And if I go back to Documentation Manager, I now have that new class method. Well, let's run this again and just see that everything works. We're going to update. Oh, we don't need that. Let's get rid of the breakpoint. I'm going to hold down the Command Return key to just go through everything. We're going to display. This looks good. Pick a universal. We already typed in something for Hello World. Let's see if we get it back out. Why, there it is. Great. We're not going to add anything to it, so we're just going to dump out of there. Now I want to illustrate a little something here. We're going to back up to this get text operation and go over here to the documentation class. Suppose I had something special I wanted to do when I got the text. Maybe I just didn't want to get the straight value of this attribute. Suppose I wanted to process it, maybe put quotes at the end of it or something. What I would like is a method that gets the text. Those are called getters, and we can also have setters. And the reason we don't have get and set methods like the old Prograph CPX had is because we have another method of providing that, which we think is pretty easy. You click on the attribute, and if you do a right click on the mouse, you get an option to create accessor methods. So I'm going to select that. Obviously something changed here. I'm going to save it. If I look in the documentation, I now have two new methods which at their basic level get the text and allow me to set the text. And one thing that I like is this set text does not have an output. Most of the time I would just like to set the text and not pass along pass the object along. So now I'm going to go back here and I'm going to replace this with the get text method, and we'll also do it with set text. When you drag and drop, always drag from the source window directly onto the destination window. There is unfortunately a long-standing bug in the Marten IDE which we've never quite been able to get rid of, and it could crash if you went dragging it around across a lot of windows. Alright, so we're going to get the text, and we're going to set the text, and we're going to get rid of these raw get and set operations. Get this down here, make sure it happens before that. And in fact, we'd like to make sure this happens before this. Generally, you don't need to put in synchros because underneath the hood there's an algorithm that always tries to reorder the execution order of these operations so that the tests come first. But just for completeness, we'll stick it in there. Alright, we're at this point. Let's get the text. Yep, there it is. We're not going to modify it. So it's just going to happen here. Take the breakpoint out. And now this tool is good to go. Let's do some new. What are we going to do for the documentation for universal documentation? This universal launches this dialog so that the user can enter documentation text for the selected universal method. And what about hello world? Yep, still in there. So that concludes this quick tutorial on some extra features of the Marten runtime. One that we haven't talked about is update. We'll save that. Update and export. Import, I'll just give you a quick rundown. I think we're going to disable this. This was a command that allowed you to import old Prograph CPX files. That can only be done on a PowerPC machine, and generally we haven't supported PowerPC machines for quite a while, so don't use that. Cut, copy, paste, delete, duplicate, we got all that. Move to section. Oh, let's do that real quick. Let's create a new section called documentation section, I guess. We're going to save it. It's going to take a while to find it, but we'll get there. It sure is looking hard for it. Takes it a while. You know what, I'll just cancel. But what I'm going to do is I am going to take the documentation manager and the documentation class, and I am going to move them to a new section, and it's going to be the documentation section. So there they go. So there's that menu item. We talked about, propagate attribute. Let's take a quick look at that. Here's my class. The name is Sue. Down here, let's make this Thomas. Propagate attribute is a way to take the value of a parent class or superclass, and for the name attribute, make sure that all of its subclasses will be initialized to that value. So the subclass has Thomas, the parent class has Sue. If I select that and go to propagate attribute, well, now Thomas, my special class has the name Sue. Okay. Reveal container, that simply means if I have this, a reveal container is going to bring that to the front. Another way to do it, and the way I generally do it, is to hold down the command key and go up to the icon, and you get not only the container, but the entire hierarchy of containers. Find is pretty clear. Run mode. That's interesting. We don't use this much anymore, but you are able to annotate operations so that they can be annotated to be skipped, or you can annotate them so that they will only be executed when you are running the debugger, and if you were to sort of compile them, they would not be executed. I would leave those alone. We haven't done anything with them for a while, and I doubt they work quite as they should anymore. We talked about operations to local, local to method. Tidy operations is great. If I do this and send this around, what I do tidy is going to shove everything up. It won't straighten that out, but it will pull everything as tight as it can, and then when you click the zoom button here, you'll get a good sized case window. Resize operations is for older code, which I doubt anyone will come across. We do have old code that doesn't look very good. We did change the parameters for where to place these bubbles and so forth, the size of the operations and so on. Should you ever get some old code and you wished it looked a little nicer, you can select the operations and resize them. We've run through all of the controls. Insert node. I don't think I even know what that does. Windows. We'll discuss that another time. The easiest one to use is information, though. That's always kind of handy. It lists your classes, it lists the universals, it lists all your breakpoints, messages, tools. Just gives you quite an overview of everything, and you can search on primitives and so forth. Run. Well, we haven't really talked about that much, but we've demonstrated. I guess our next tutorial will discuss those. Tools we've now discussed. We've pretty much covered it all, except for perhaps some of the issues with run. Well, that concludes this tutorial, and next time we'll finish up with the last of the Marten commands, and then I encourage you to start looking at the videos for Cocoa application design, where we are designing a class foundation from scratch for use on Mac OS X.